the US. Perhaps another, who knows, million jobs to be lost in state and local government as they put their budget houses in order as the private sector rebounds. Nouriel identified high unemployment in the US as a real risk. Cover of The Atlantic this month, fabulous article by Christian Friedland. The rise of the new ruling class, how the global elite is leaving you behind. And the Harvard Business Review, a terrific piece by Michael Porter and Mark Kramer, which starts off by saying, the capitalist system is under siege. In recent years, business increasingly has been viewed as a major cause of social, environmental, and economic problems. The legitimacy of business has fallen to levels not seen in recent history. Crikey! So as international businessmen like you, lie awake at night, I mean, do you hear the rattle of tumbrils and the clacking of tricoteuses knitting needles? Do you think revolution is on the way? No, you don't. No.
Shall I?
Yeah, come on. Either of you.
You lie awake at night?
I mean,
no, I think it is a serious issue. I mean, if you see what is happening in North Africa and the potential, we were talking before about today as a crucial day in Egypt and elsewhere in the Middle East. I just came from the Sundance Film Festival. There's a film called The Flaw, F-L-A-W, which picks up on Alan Greenspan's testimony to Congress and the flaw that he saw in the model. And what it does, a very interesting graph in it, which tracks inequality, the concentration of wealth in the United States from 1920 to today. And the inequality peaked in 1929. And I think I'm right, it peaked at about 2007, maybe even a little bit later than that. And this issue about inequality is a matter of economic debate. They had Schiller in it. I think Lewis Byron in it as well. Stieglitz in it. We're all interviewed, and it's this question about whether inequality. Wealthy people invest in financial assets. They create asset bubbles. Whereas if wealth is more distributed, there's an investment in more mass consumption and therefore capacity, and economies prosper more as a result. So this concentration of wealth, particularly in the United States, I think is a big issue. And how you deal with it, whether you then attack it by increasing marginal tax rates, obviously controversial. Whether that's the issue, we were talking again about this before. I think, Nouriel, you were of the view that may be one of the policy. To deal with the deficit, you have to increase tax rates. And they have to come either from direct taxation or indirect taxation. And what this film was talking about was the wisdom, maybe, of increasing direct rates, particularly on the more wealthy. Not a popular message in some sections of the economy.
Jim, do you want to come in?
You know, Michael, it is interesting. Every business person around the world has, we've all been in the same bucket, demonized over the last several years, and maybe it began at the peak of inequality of earnings in 2007. I think I'm beginning to detect a little bit of a change as there became a realization that the more business activity and private sector activity is demonized, the less of it you're going to get and the less job growth you're going to get. And so at the end of the day, I think that there has been at least a tone change from Washington on that point that I think might actually begin to move the cycle back towards recognizing that we all need to figure out how to coordinate globally. We all need to get across the difficulties between countries around trade, and we all need to figure out that businesses need to succeed in order to have employment for people. But we don't have the exact path yet. I thought the State of the Union did a nice job of talking about competitiveness around taxes, around trade, talked about tone, but as Martin said, it lacked details. So I'm not sure.
It was big on vision.
Right, big on vision.
I just want to come back to what Nouriel said about G0, which I think we should have credited. I think it was Ian Bremmer's piece, came out about 2 or 3 weeks ago, which I commend everybody to read, where he talks about there isn't a G7, a G8, or there is the risk there is not a G7, a G8, or G20. There's really a G0. What he's talking about is the rise of protectionism, the sort of things that we are seeing in Africa and elsewhere. And I don't want to blow Klaus Schwab's trumpet too loudly, but I do think we don't have an international or a multinational business organization like a G20 or a G7 or a G8. It doesn't exist. And one of the things that was discussed in Seoul at the last G20 meeting and got some momentum was the issue of a voice for multinational business to deal with the sort of issues you're raising, Michael. because business is not seen in a good light. If you look at all the trust indices that PR companies like our own and others put out, business is very much at the low end of the totem pole. It's not just bankers, it's not just investment bankers or commercial bankers, it's business as a whole. And it is a very serious issue. It mirrors the issue that we were talking about in the hectoring of the West or the lecturing of the West to the East or the South or the Southeast. And I think it is something that leading business people are going to talk about here with, I think, President Sarkozy in the context of his presidency of the G20. And it's something that we must wrestle with. Because things like the Business Council are US bodies, and it's all very fractured. Bringing it together, one voice, if we manage to do that, develop a voice to influence policy in a constructive way, I think is needed.
Michael, real quickly on this, because Sir Martin mentioned the IBC earlier that he chairs. I remember at an IBC summer meeting, this is a group of the CEOs of many of the big companies at WEF, there was a discussion, to your point, of is capitalism like dead, and we need to figure out something to put in its place. The feedback from the IBC members from the emerging economies of China and India were go slow on that. They said that from their perspective, much of sort of free market capitalism has been the best thing to help lift economies in their parts of the world, and so they were exercising caution as far as tossing out too quickly. It was an interesting dichotomy.
Zoom in, and then we'll take some questions from the audience.
Yeah, thank you. And the increase in inequality, obviously, the most serious challenge we're facing today for the whole world.
The most serious
challenge we're facing today for the whole world, not only from the advanced economy, but also from the emerging market, but obviously from different causes. I mean, in the emerging market, because the very strong growth and increase, the distribution issues and the income gap increase, but in advance as well. But I would like to follow up on Martin's comments. I think it's not only the tax issues. We need to go further. The first question is, if you see the income really diverging in the past 10 years, the first question is how and where this wealth has been created. I think this is the most important. You're absolutely right. If you're looking for U.S. cases, the inequality peaked in 2028 before the big crisis. 1% American hold roughly 48% wealth. I'm talking about wealth, not talking about the wage. After the crisis, it was Jim Jang. In 1968, roughly 1% American hold 28% the whole U.S. wealth. Getting up in 2000, it's become 42. 2008, go back to 47% again. But if you see behind that, it's always a parallel with the booming of the stock market and the financial sector. So that's go back to the fundamental questions, where the wealth should be created. And then is the wealth should be distributed, then redistributed. So I think we have to go back to fundamentals. When fit this into our growth model, as I mentioned before, I think it is a very important issue. So many issues to tell us that we cannot let the income disparities increase further. The crisis gave a break, but I don't think the world paid enough attention on these issues.
And just to underline one of your first comments on that intervention, Zhu-Min, inequality is not just a rich, developed world problem. On the contrary, as growth has been speeding up in the developing world, it's become a problem anyway.
It's everyone.
You have the India Inclusive campaign here in Davos, which is dealing with this issue in the context, or attempting to deal with this issue in the context of Indian growth and development, that it's becoming too high and low, too rich and poor oriented.
And the political instability that you see right now, for example, in the Middle East is not just food prices. There is inequality, there is corruption, high levels of unemployment rate among the young people. So this is a very dangerous combination of factors, and certainly the income and wealth inequality exacerbates those things.
I have a feeling that inequality is going to be one of the key words of Davos this year, actually. Let's take some questions. Gentlemen over here, I'm sure there'll be, that there will be microphones. I think one is heading your way right as we speak. One here and then over here. Gentlemen in the front row, please. If you could state your name, that would be great.
Good morning. Gerard Lyons from Standard Chartered. And congratulate the panel on the fantastic debate. It's not so much a question as a comment that I'd welcome the panel's observations on. A couple of years ago, Obama's chief of staff, Trevor Emanuel, or Mr. Emanuel, said you shouldn't waste a good crisis. What's very interesting is across the emerging world, it seems to me, they've taken that to heart. One of the most interesting things that the panel hasn't talked about yet is the fact that in the West, people assume value will be created in the West, and the West needs to sort of stay ahead up the value curve. One of the most interesting observations we've seen at Standard Chartered in the last 2 years is the extent to which emerging economies have really moved up the value curve. And this year's 12th five-year plan from China is a further sign of that. And just to finish, it's not just China and India. What's interesting is the infrastructure boom we're seeing on the ground across Africa, in the Middle East. It reinforces this new trade corridor aspect across the emerging world, intra-Asia, Asia-Africa, Asia-Middle East. And basically, it seems to me the challenges are going to be as great in the future as Mr. Zumin and others touched on for the West and for the SMEs. But it's a very interesting dynamic that be interesting to hear the panel's observations on.
It's something we were touching on in the green room earlier. Martin, I mean, you and I were talking about the extent to which innovation and new business practices are being discovered in the developing world.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to get out of the lexicon the words developing or emerging. You know, China is a $5 trillion economy. Against 15 trillion, it's true for the US, out of 65 trillion, whatever it is worldwide, but we must get it out of the lexicon. There are other countries, absolutely. Vietnam, Bangladesh, Pakistan, despite the political problems. The other thing is, we all talk about shift from west to east. It's actually a shift from west to east, west to south. This is the decade of Latin America. Brazil with the World Cup and the Olympics certainly is going to be very important in the context of Latin America, but other countries, Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, the Andina region. We've seen the stock exchanges coming together. And indeed, the Southeast. Your point about Africa and the Middle East, we've seen in our industry great growth. The Chinese really understand. You know, the suggestion that there are 800,000 Chinese working in African countries on various infrastructure, energy projects, food projects, suggests they, as usual, state-directed capitalism works. Having a Politburo of engineers running an economy, not a bad system.
Azim,
it's a very interesting concept which is coming up now, whether it be in India or whether it be in China, but I think it's really come up in India, the concept of reverse engineering of products.
Yeah.
The moment multinationals wish to address a mass market, which requires high volume, very low price points, they cannot think in terms of mindsets of an American sitting in Milwaukee or mindsets of an automobile design engineer sitting in Detroit. And a very interesting case study on this, which really brings out this contrast, is Ford's entry into India. Fords were pioneers into India, and Ford is a very successful company globally. And they wanted to bring a mid-end car to India.